emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 688.PR1301, certificate number 45274. Martin Luther King, Sr.
Live it in sermons that people can see every day. So we accept it. Now, not at all do we accept this saying it doesn't hurt, that we don't feel it, that we aren't concerned. I often state, and I mean this, my head is bloody, but unbowed.
Happy Martin Luther King Day.
What a twist.
Is Martin Luther King Day a day that you say happy about? I mean, it seems like it's a more complicated holiday than just like,
we
Happy Martin Luther
commemorate.
King Day.
There's not a lot of greeting cards for it. Maybe they just say Happy Martin Luther King Day.
Yeah, when I first moved to the East Coast many, many, many years ago, I had never seen Orthodox Jews, and certainly never seen ultra Orthodox Jews,
like Hasidic outfits and accoutrement.
And I remember I was driving through a neighborhood, and there was a guy kind of walking to temple, and I knew it was Rosh Hashanah, but I didn't know exactly what that meant. And I rolled my window down and I said, "Happy Rosh Hashanah," and he gave me a look that was just like, Happy Rosh Hashanah? Okay.
I mean, that is one of the happy ones.
It is.
It could have been Happy Yom Kippur, and that would have been worse.
It was pretty, of all of the dark holidays, but it's not really, I mean, I don't think anybody had ever wished him happy Rosh Hashanah. Not how he thought of it, at least.
Or maybe you're the most Gentile guy ever to try it.
Exactly. Hey there. Hello, friend.
Well, I mean, I guess, so Dr. King was born on January 15th, which means we hardly ever celebrate the holiday on his actual birthday.
Right.
But you and I are old enough that we remember a time when creating a federal holiday for Dr. King was controversial.
Yeah, for sure.
To the degree that like the crazy governor of Arizona was against it.
Right.
And wouldn't have a red baiting communist like Dr. King celebrated in his state.
That's right. Although Chuck D took care of that, didn't he?
Yeah. Evan Meekum, no match for Chuck D. Well, it lasted. I mean, the hangover of that was, I think, when I was living in Utah in the 90s and maybe into the 2000s when I was on Jeopardy. That was a day off in the great state of Utah. But there were enough old John Birch weirdos who would rankle at the idea of it being called Martin Luther King Day that it was called Human Rights Day or something like that. Like maybe not even Civil Rights Day, because even that would be a little pink,
right. Not all humans.
We're not against human rights, right. Are we, in Utah? And so that's literally what the thing would say, Happy Human Rights Day, Utahns.
That's interesting. And in a way that actually celebrates Martin Luther King even more sort of emphatically.
I'm sure he wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
He wouldn't be all about the name recognition.
But yeah, we remember, well, I mean, when I was a kid, certainly there were no Martin Luther King Jr. streets. And then increasingly every city had one. And as Chris Rock famously said, they commemorated Martin Luther King by naming in every town the worst street after him.
What's that, a Chris Rock joke?
I think so. But yeah, in Seattle it was Empire Way, famously.
Oh, I don't even remember what Martin Luther King Jr. Way was.
Yeah, Empire Way. And you can still, if you drive down MLK, you can still see like the Empire Way Tavern. Like some of the businesses that predated it are still called Empire Way.
It looks like Utah had Human Rights Day until 2000.
What? Really?
That was the last year that it was controversial in Utah. 1999 was the last year in which Dr. King was controversial in Utah. I'm sure he still is in small enough towns.
You know, we live in King County, Washington.
Oh, right.
And King County was named after what?
William Rufus King, I want to say.
Rufus King.
He was the vice president at the time, right? And in fact, hasn't he been an omnibus related to James Buchanan possibly being his romantic partner and then him dying in Cuba?
Did we talk about him being the namesake of our own county, or at least original namesake? Because
we must have, yeah.
In 2005, although King County had all the name recognition, they didn't want to rename it completely, but they did name it Martin Luther King County.
It's still King County. They changed the logo.
They changed the logo to be a silhouette of Martin Luther King.
It's no longer some plantation owner who was pining for James Buchanan and died in Cuba.
Pretty nice, pretty convenient. But Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader and famous American.
I feel like you don't need to explain Martin Luther King Jr.
No, but his name does suggest a Martin Luther King Sr.
It implies the existence of a Martin Luther King Sr.
And as I was thinking about Civil Rights Day, or Human Rights Day,
as we say,
coming up,
as we say in Utah County,
it did. It just sort of occurred to me, like, well, wait a minute, was there a Martin Luther King Sr.? And so it sent me on like a pretty marvelous deep dive about Martin Luther King Jr.'s father,
who would, by the transitive property, be
Martin Luther King Sr.
You know, we have this problem in my family where my dad is Kenneth Wayne Jennings Jr.
Yes.
And so he'll introduce himself to somebody as Ken Jennings Jr., or they'll see his name on something with the Jr., and they'll say, "Oh, like the Jeopardy guy. Haha, he's your dad." And he'll say, "No, Ken Jennings is my son.
You're Ken Jennings.
I'm
Kenneth
the third.
Wayne Jennings 3.
But nobody thinks of me that way." So I don't know if he loves or hates the idea that it kind of seems like he's the son of his own son.
But your grandfather, Kenneth Wayne Jennings, is dead.
Yes. And passed away in the 90s, so this was never an issue.
So in the old way, right,
we all would have been promoted?
You would have been promoted, and then your dad would have been 1 and you would have been 2?
I feel like we looked this up once when you asked me about this, and I had never heard of this, and it still strikes me as weird.
Yeah. I mean, this was a thing that I used to argue with my friend Rick Garnett 3, in Anchorage, because Rick Garnett 1 had died, and I was in that high school way where you're just like so contradictory, so like you're bickering with your friends all the time about tiny picayune matters. Mm-hmm. And I was like, technically you're not Rick Garnett 3. And he insisted that the American way had allowed for it.
Well, I think it's true because we get it from all the rich dynastic people who were very intent on there being a Nelson Rockefeller the Fourth or whatever.
Right.
They didn't want to lose the numbering just because somebody died. They wanted to express the idea that there had been 8 generations of their weird name.
My dad was a junior, and he hated his dad so much that he refused to append junior to his name. And then he named my oldest brother after himself, but changed the middle name so he would not be a 3.
Well, I mean, I think the justification is given that you don't need to disambiguate anymore when someone's dead. And it's true you don't at the dinner table, but there might still be disambiguation. Yeah. Like, "Oh, are you the one who wrote?" "No, I'm sorry, he's passed." There might still be value to not taking over your dad's.
I mean, your dad is recognizably your dad. He looks enough like you.
You're turning to look at a picture of him, a portrait of him right now.
Yeah, he's. I see the framed picture of him there on your shelf, and if someone ran into him at the grocery store, they could conceivably think he'd written map heads.
I don't think because he looks like me, or because he looks like a map nerd.
Yeah, he looks like a guy that wrote the book Map Heads.
He looks nerdy enough to have some of my achievements, not the televised ones.
No,
because those people know what I look like.
I guess, yeah.
He would have been a very good Jeopardy player.
Would he?
I think so. He just missed his chance. He can't come on now. I'd be like, hey, Dad. No, that's wrong. Yeah, that's wrong too.
No, Dad, no. Well, the interesting thing about Martin Luther King Jr., the one we know better.
The one interesting thing about him we're about to learn?
The one interesting thing about him.
Was it, I hope, his dedication to justice and equality?
That is uninteresting thing about him.
One interesting thing. Have you unearthed another?
Well, his backstory is the reason that we kind of don't maybe know it so well is that his own path to being a minister and to being a crusader for justice is kind of in the sense of sometimes a crusader will have a galvanizing moment.
Right. Conversion story.
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr.'s story is kind of unremarkable in that sense, in that he was sort of always, in a way, preordained, if you will, to be a minister and a crusader because he had a role model in his own father and in his maternal grandfather.
Oh, his mom's dad was also a preacher?
Was a well-known preacher and civil rights leader, even in a time in Georgia where that would have been a very dangerous profession.
He kind of appeared, my memory is he kind of appeared on the national scene as a fairly young man.
Yeah.
So it's not like he could have had some, 10 years in the wilderness and then, like, he's his parents' kid and he's a young man when people start seeing him on magazine covers, right?
And when he tells the story of his own life, he tells it like, I grew up in a stable home with loving parents and, not a lot of strife that would have kind of taken me from,
Right.
and in fact, not the strife that actually galvanized his father to become a minister.
Or with the kind of thing you read about when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X. There's a civil rights origin story that involves, a jail cell and a moment of personal enlightenment and truth and, several different kind of Damascus moments.
Right. And we're talking about Georgia in the 1920s, which was still a very contentious and Jim Crow.
Yeah, Jim Crow's already
place.
well established by then. We're well into the lost cause mythos of that you kind of engulfed and changed the South in the post-Reconstruction era.
But Martin Luther King Jr. was only a couple of generations removed from slavery in the South. And so living memory, really.
Right.
And so even growing up...
Yeah, he would have known people who were enslaved in the 20s.
Yeah. Growing up in a comfortable home and in a stable environment obviously didn't make him immune to the racial politics of Georgia at the time. But his father was actually the son of sharecroppers. He was born... His father's father, Martin Luther King's grandfather, James Albert King, was born in 1864.
Oh, wow, during the war.
And his father, so Martin Luther King's great-grandfather, was actually an Irishman who married a freed slave by the name of Melinda. And so James Albert King was not born into slavery.
He lived in the North.
He lived in the North.
He was born a free man then if he was born to a freed slave and her Irish husband.
Right. And his wife too also, that's right. His parents moved to Georgia. So he was born in the North, but his folks moved to Georgia after the war and were part of the kind of pre-diaspora sharecropping community. They were very poor farmers, lived in a suburb of Atlanta, but at the time, right, Atlanta had been burned. It was not the metropolis it is now. And unfortunately, James Albert King he suffered from alcoholism And he was like decidedly an unreligious man. Like,
oh, interesting.
Not convinced, and also cynical about it. And I think he, growing up and then living in that era in Georgia, felt like God had no claim over him. And
You could see the reasons, but it was probably a little unusual in his community, right? You would assume.
it was. I mean, he was contrary in that sense, but also kind of made a case that if God existed, he would have done better by them.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that home was dirt poor and also kind of had a level of alcoholic violence in it. James Albert King married a woman by the name of Delia Lindsay, who was a devout woman, and they together had 9 children.
And wait, am I doing this math right? That like then was her father was a preacher, or is that one more generation?
No,
down?
that's one
Oh, that's
generation
one down.
more.
Okay.
Yeah. So he was born.
I need a chart.
Yeah, I know.
I'm making a chart.
Every
right now.
genealogy, if you go back more than 3 generations, becomes like a jumble of names, right?
That's why you make a chart.
But he was born, Martin Luther King's father was born Michael King in 1897.
Martin Luther King Sr. was born Michael King?
Michael King.
Okay.
And
That doesn't have the same ring.
Michael King
I mean,
is
top NBA prospect maybe, but
yeah, Michael King his name does not ring out in the
Reverend Dr. Michael King.
Michael King.
Not as good.
It doesn't seem like a Nobel Prize will be awarded to a Mike King, does it?
Kids are not going to get a day off in January for Mike.
And Michael grew up in a large household that was kind of an unhappy place. And Delia was one of these women that you see in people's backstories who just bore the brunt of not only their poverty, but also like a husband that wasn't not only not necessarily contributive, but sort of destructive.
Outright abusive.
And so she worked both as a sharecropper, and then in the winter she would go in to white homes and do their chores.
Not a lot of jobs a black woman could have to make extra money at the time.
That's right. And then was also kind of a moral foundation for the family. And so she took them all to her sort of local church in Stockbridge, Georgia. And
James Albert King sat home on Sunday morning grumbling while she took all the kids.
And the church was like a path, even and this would have been a small rural church. This was a place where Michael King first saw like a black role model who had, the force that a minister has, kind of the moral force, the rhetorical ability. And in this era, we don't think of the early 20s as being a time when you have like a ton of examples of like a civil rights movement, a nascent civil rights movement. But of course there was one. And the defiance of white authority and of those conventions was a kind of, there were plenty of people in Georgia who like openly defied, often at great peril, white authority. And you would see that in particular in churchmen and church hierarchies, because they were established members of the community. They weren't a farmer. They could point to their bona fides. It was much harder to throw a minister in jail.
Still running a great risk,
Yeah.
I guess. But yeah, maybe they have a little more leeway with Jim Crow era authorities, right?
And so Michael King kind of sat in these small churches because, Delia was a little non-denominational, I guess, at first. Kind of took Michael and his brothers and sisters to a variety of churches. They settled on the Floyd Baptist Church, or the Floyd Chapel Baptist Church. And Michael was so galvanized by the experience of watching preachers work that he started to emulate them. His mother reported that the first time she saw him preaching, he was offering a eulogy for a dead chicken. Like he would kind of go out and
real kind of community level pastoral handholding. Right?
That's right. And Michael also, saw the brutality of the Jim Crow South. He witnessed a lynching.
Oh yeah.
He saw a lot of injustice and just had a natural outrage. I'm sure the outrage was universal, but had a natural defiance. Mm-hmm. And as a teenager, started preaching. And this was a time when, to get an education as a black kid was a challenge. There was a school called the Bryant Prep School that he attended, but it was one of these sort of like he would go 3 days a week. In his description, they had no books, pencils.
Maybe your preacher does not have a divinity degree.
Probably not.
Self-appointed, self-taught.
And they didn't, they had no blackboard. There wasn't any really what we would call the accoutrements of a school. Yeah. But he loved going to school and eventually got his GED. And his sister, Woody King.
Michael's sister.
Adding
to the chart.
At one point, moved to Atlanta, which would have been, they were living in Stockbridge, a suburb of it. Woody moved to Atlanta and started boarding in a home of a preacher by the name of A.D. Williams. And A.D. Williams was a very prominent member of the Atlanta black community and was the minister or the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, which had been founded right after the Civil War.
Oh, so it's a I know about it in association with the King family, but it was already a venerable church, huh?
Well, no, it was not. It was a very small church at the time. It had been founded by a man named John Andrew Parker, and even by the time of Michael King's birth, it only had 13 members. But it had been taken over by A.D. Williams, and he was a very successful preacher, so that pretty quickly, in 1894, it had 13 members, but by 1903, it had 400 members.
Ebenezer, by the way, strikes us as a funny name for a church because we associate it with Ebenezer Scrooge.
Right, but Ebenezer Scrooge was named after...
Yeah, it's a biblical name. It's from 1 Samuel. The prophet Samuel puts up a stone, I think, as a memorial to a place where Israel has defeated the Palestinians. So it represents, God's steadfastness and loyalty and, to a Christian congregation, the rock that is Christ. It's a sign of God's firmness from the Bible, I guess.
God's firmness.
Because you can't say God's not firm.
God of all things is firm.
Especially in the Old Testament. John, you and I are both in lines of work where a nice head of hair is important. Rock stars and game show hosts are the two leading professions that rely on robustness of hair.
That's right, because sometimes you will turn and the camera will catch the glare off if you were balding anymore. And the problem with being a rock star is you're backlit. So if your hair is thinning, even if it looks good in certain light, every once in a while, you'll get hit with a flash of light from behind and everybody can see right through your facade.
In my 40s, I did start to worry. I was like, my hair I think it's not as thick as it was. And I proactively decided to do something about it.
You did.
Because there are FDA-approved ways to keep and even regain a nice head of hair. And if you have not explored those options, might we recommend, should we dare to recommend hymns to our listeners?
I think we should, because, the thing about hair loss is there's this feeling that once it's happened, it's too late to get it back. But in fact, if you've lost your hair, it doesn't mean you can't find it again.
Hims is a service that provides you with convenient, quality access to a range of hair loss treatments that work clinically proven ingredients like finasteride and minoxidil that can grow hair back in a matter of months. And because it's this online service, You do it all from the comfort of your couch. You don't have to go get a doctor's prescription.
And what's marvelous is there are a lot of different ways you can apply hair loss treatment.
How so?
Well, you can get chewable. You can get orally administered spray, serum. You have that foam, schmutzy foam.
Just find out what works for you.
And these are sort of doctor trusted options, so you can personalize them.
You don't need insurance. One low price covers everything. And just ask their hundreds and thousands of trusted subscribers. Hims works for a lot of people.
So here's what you do. You start your free online visit today at hims.com/omnibus.
That's hims.com/omnibus, and you'll see your personalized hair loss treatment options.
hims.com/omnibus. Results vary based on studies of topical and oral minoxidil and finasteride. Prescription products require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if a prescription is appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for full details and important safety information. Well, so A.D. Was a very effective preacher and a very activist one. Member of the NAACP, somebody who was very definitely standing up to the institutions of white authority in Atlanta, standing up to kind of Jim Crow laws, and often at great risk. But he was also, and I think maybe concurrently, becoming a very respectable member of Atlanta society, and so had the literal pulpit, but also kind of the social pulpit,
the community pulpit
of having built a successful church and built a congregation that by 1913 had 750 congregants, and they set about breaking ground on a big new church, the one that we know now, that we see in the news, because Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta has ended up playing a large role both in the civil rights movement and even today. But so Woody King was then boarding there at AD's.
Woody, by the way, great name for a girl.
Isn't that a nice name?
I wonder what it's short for. Woody King. It's just Woody, I guess.
Woody.
Is that right?
Pretty sweet name. But kind of through the introduction of Woody, Michael King also moved to Atlanta and started hanging out at A.D. Williams's house and was very impressed with A.D.'s preaching. It really coincided with his own kind of hopes and dreams. And so he became an acolyte of A.D. and started being an assistant pastor at Ebenezer Baptist. And it helped that he had fallen in love with A.D.'s daughter, Alberta, and began then courting Alberta. And, what a classic time. A.D. had a big, beautiful house, and you can picture Michael King coming and courting.
From the country.
And A.D. absolutely took him under his wing and encouraged him to go to Morehouse College. He had his GED, but in 1926, Michael enrolled at Morehouse, the historically black college that has produced so many great leaders.
To this day.
And although it was kind of it was challenging for him coming from a background that had so little access to books and knowledgeable mentors. He did achieve a BA in theology by 1931. And after an 8-year courtship, I guess he was...
Wow.
8-year courtship.
8-year courtship.
And I guess this happened prior to his BA. And this was part of AD encouraging him, you've married my daughter, now go the distance. And I mean, you can imagine the sort of surrogate father relationship that he must have felt to A.D. Williams, and A.D.
not having a father figure like that at all.
Yeah, and he really put a lot of stock in him, in Michael, because in 1931, when AD died, Michael King assumed the pastorship, the senior pastor role at Ebenezer College. He and Alberta had 3 kids. And I guess now thinking about it, all 3 kids were born while he was at Morehouse.
Oh, really? During his... So before he was a professional pastor.
Well, no, he was already an assistant pastor at
I see.
Ebenezer, but also going to school. His 3 kids, his oldest kid was a daughter, Willie Christine, born in 27. And then Michael King Jr. was born in 1929. And then his youngest son, Alfred, born in 1930. And they were, because he was senior pastor there, they were wealthy and prominent in the community.
By the standards of the time.
And so, his 3 kids grew up, as Martin Luther King Jr. often said, in a comfortable, peaceful home. But at the time Ebenezer was not just a typical Baptist church. It was an era where the idea of a social gospel was, kind of rising up, an activist baptism, an activist Protestantism that sort of mirrors my introduction to that idea, that kind of theology was the liberation theology of the Catholics in
Latin America
in the 80s. Where the idea of Christianity was, in this reading of it, you could not be a Christian if you weren't actively living the teachings of Christ, and that meant that you were working on behalf of the poor. You were not living luxuriously and decadently, and thinking about Christianity as a kind of metaphor.
Or Sunday pastime.
Right. But that a pastor's role and a church's role was to really actively try to affect social change.
And this must have been very prominent in the black church, but I can't imagine that every white Baptist congregation at the time would have been politically activist in the same way. Right?
Well, no, although the social gospel movement really traces its origins to a man named Walter Rauschenbusch, who was preaching in a Hell's Kitchen church in New York City. And, of course, Hell's Kitchen then would have been a very downtrodden neighborhood. Not the neighborhood of cool lofts we know it now.
Fewer Pilates studios then,
right.
Probably.
And Rauschenbusch had a lot of acolytes around the country. One of the most prominent was also preaching in New York at the Riverside Church, Henry Emerson Fosdick. A lot of these names, Walter Rauschenbusch and Henry Fosdick, you wouldn't run into them at a typical Montessori school now.
What happened to all the Fosdicks?
I don't know what happened to the Rauschenbusches either. They're probably still a few. They're 100%.
Go to the Midwest, go to a football game, you'll see Rauschenbusches.
Omnibus is going to hear from Rauschenbusches and Fosdicks who listen to the show.
If your first name, you can just choose not to name your kid Dick, but if your family name is Fosdick, you're stuck.
Yeah.
You're Fosdicks forever. You can't Ellis Island that away.
Yeah, I guess you could change the spelling of your name. Fosdeich. I don't know. Seems unlikely.
Maybe it's worse.
But so there was a sort of activist Protestantism in the time between the two wars, that in the case of our story kind of culminated in a World Baptist Alliance meeting that happened in 1934 in Berlin.
Oh.
Where people from, Baptist ministers from around the world all congregated in Berlin to
just happened to be in Berlin that year,
to be in Berlin. And so Michael went.
It's too late to change it, I guess. Yeah, we're going to be in Berlin next year.
Like January of 1934 and December of 1934, like a lot had happened.
Yeah.
But so Michael was there for the World Baptist Alliance and actually bore witness to the rise of Nazism. And it had a profound effect on him. He also went to the Holy Land during that period with a bunch of people from the World Baptist Alliance and saw the conditions there, and I think got a real visceral sense of what Christ's life would have been like. And I think part of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the appeal of it over the last 2,000 years, for a lot of that time, Jerusalem would have been
kind of unchanged.
and a pretty barren, dusty, and small, humble. I mean,
Right.
all of Palestine would have and Christians loved this. I think to come back from that
Right.
experience, going like,
It's like I was in his footsteps.
yeah, it just seems like
The same roads.
I saw the very same straw hut that
Yeah.
Joseph must have. It's like, yeah, I guess. But the experience of that really galvanized him. And interestingly, he'd always, because his mother had taken him in her quest for, a good church for them, had taken him to Lutheran churches at the time in his young years. He'd always kind of been intrigued by the story of Martin Luther, and his trip to Germany introduced him to it to a greater degree.
He got to do Reformation tourism.
He did. And although I don't think the same swords and sandals effect was true in
Right.
tracing Martin Luther's
But some of the
steps.
cathedrals are still there.
Yeah,
right?
for sure. He came back and was really so affected by it that at first he adopted the middle name Luther. So for a while he was Michael Luther King. And then through, over the next couple of months and years, really decided that he was reinventing himself utterly in the image of this classic reformer, and changed his name to Martin Luther King, and then changed the name of his son.
I guess if his son is a junior,
Yeah.
it's an interesting asterisk. If you have a son who's a junior and you change your name by the transitive property,
That's right. And Michael King Jr. would have been, he was born in 1929, so he would have been less than 10 years old.
but he's still got friends who know him as Mike.
Yeah. Well, for the rest of their lives, both he and his father were called by family members Michael.
Oh, interesting.
Or ML. ML was
Because that could be Michael Luther.
right.
You have to wonder. I mean, he's already, at the time he does this, he's already a pastor with the congregation.
Yeah.
So it's like your pastor has just announced, I am changing my name.
Yeah.
I have a new identity.
Although he didn't change his name to Bo Peep or Starbeam, there was a kind of, in a way, sort of a Malcolm X experience where,
The 60s era, flower children, you mean, picking.
well, yeah, it wasn't just like I'm actually a starseed. Malcolm X changed his name as part of his religious conversion,
Yeah.
and I think it was obviously not a conversion, but he changed it in a sort of fervor for what Martin Luther would have represented as a church reformer and as
We're just accustomed to that in a conversion to Islam narrative.
Right.
And we're not accustomed to the idea of middle-aged Protestant pastors.
yeah, and he didn't obviously convert to Lutheranism.
That's also funny that he stays a Baptist preacher.
Yeah,
But
I think in trying to turn the Baptist church from being maybe a conservative or insular church into one that was going to take action, that felt
Yeah.
like an appropriate renaming.
so
And-
it might be like this is a new phase, just like Malcolm X changing his name.
And as the leader of the Ebenezer Church, which now had grown to be a church of over 1,000 congregants, he started to really take an activist approach to civil rights issues in pre-war Georgia.
Oh, wow.
So he, and he did little sort of Rosa Parks protests where he refused to ride the colored elevator at the courthouse. He refused to, just sort of genuflect to what he thought of, in a way, he thought of segregation as a ludicrous thing. I think
It just needed to be unmasked.
the idea of it being an institution might have made its ridiculousness
Yeah.
kind of be masked, and his initial response, or rather, I guess his lifelong response to it was, are we real? All you need to do is look at this twice and understand that it's like,
indefensible.
yeah, indefensible and also like just ridiculous, right? And so he was pointing that out constantly. His first big, like civil rights movement was actually an agitation for an increase in teachers' salaries, which put him as it would any kind of prominent black man at the time, like put him in the crosshairs of the establishment. But he really understood that voting was going to be the key element to what became the civil rights movement. And so he was part of and a real driver of voters' rights drive.
Registration drives.
But and in one famous speech, he said, that he was never going to plow behind a mule again, and he was never going to step off the road to let white folk pass.
It's I thought about this recently. It's kind of it should have been an obvious point, but it was eye-opening to me. I don't know if it's Ta-Nehisi Coates or who pointed this out, but somebody was kind of worrying about, what does an America look like that descends into fascism? This is kind of a what if people have been thinking about since the 30s, since Michael King was in Berlin. And this person, whoever the commentator was, pointed out, like America was a fascist state for decades effectively. Like if you were black, you were living in the equivalent of Nazi Germany. You lived in an authoritarian America for generations. Your dad had, and you had, and you thought your kids would. So
maybe more analogous to like a South Africa than a Nazi Germany.
And that's something you and I are familiar with, an apartheid comparison. But the idea that you could actually compare it to a fascist state and that they were effectively living in a totalitarian government that was not affecting their neighbors, that there was an America that was not a functioning democracy for a huge chunk of its populace. I guess it's an obvious point that I had never actually considered as the right metaphor before. But it's kind of undeniable that this is not something that would be new for America if it started stripping rights away from its citizens. We've just been selective about it.
And what's interesting is that is kind of the kernel of the woke movement, the kernel of it being, this is something that half of the people, or a large percentage of the people are very aware of.
Yeah.
But the majority of people
are
not aware of it all.
Have not had to confront, and things are fine.
Yeah, it's just right in front of you all the time, and you don't see it because when you walk into a jewelry store, they don't lock the cabinets.
Yeah.
And the difference, although it might seem to you, and I think that, that woke conversation really started as a response to people saying, well, why don't you just obey the police? Like if you talk back, that's why you get in trouble. And having black people say, it's really not.
It's nice that you think that.
Yeah, but there are other things that you're not aware of.
That is not realistic for everyone.
And it's very true that, and another thing about the civil rights movement is that it didn't start in 1959 or 55, right? It didn't.
Yeah.
Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to leave her seat at the front of the bus. And we do have a tendency to think of it as a post-war phenomenon because a few people, including maybe most prominently Martin Luther King Jr., turned it into an unstoppable force
on a national stage.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was Michael King, Martin Luther King Sr., was a lifelong Republican. And had voted for
as I'm sure most of his community was.
That's right. Yeah. Had voted for the Republican Party the whole time, or his whole life.
Just like his dad did back to Reconstruction.
Right. Back to the first ancestor he had that voted.
Yeah.
And it was really when his son got thrown in jail and RFK, I guess he wasn't even the Attorney General yet. Kennedy was running for office, and RFK called the local authorities and made a personal appeal to have his son released from jail. And in response to that, he prior to that had absolutely not only no love for Kennedy, but objected to him as a Catholic. And it was only after this personal intervention that he switched his allegiance to the Democratic Party.
That must have been an age-dependent process. These, Black Southerners deciding, well, am I switching to the party of segregation? Am I a Democrat now that it seems to be that the northern wing of the party is pivoting? Like, when do you make that switch?
It's 100%. And, we think about it now in terms of the Republican Party, which has, to most of us who grew up with a Republican Party that was pretty measured and slow to act and a little bit lectury, finger waggy, all the words we think of when we say conservative. And now the Republican Party, absolutely unrecognizably bonkers in so many ways. And the Democrats between 1955 and 1965, really went, completely upended who they were. And it wasn't just the northern part of the party, because it was LBJ that did so much of that. Probably couldn't have worked if it wasn't a Southerner. Yeah, and his Civil Rights Act, famously, he said, "I've lost the South for a generation." Turns out more than a generation.
He guessed low.
Ken, 2025 is here.
Happy New Year, John.
Hey, it's nice to be in the spring, or it's almost the spring.
Spring adjacent.
It's a ways from the spring, let's be honest.
I like your rosy outlook.
But, I've been trying to go to the gym. I've been trying to, do the fad diets. I've been trying to live up to my BS resolutions.
No. What if you made a different kind of resolution this year, John? What if you were to save some serious cash by making the switch to Mint Mobile?
Well, what if I prefer my overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, unexpected overages, and all that other BS?
Then you deserve to suffer, because right now you could get half off Mint Mobile's 3-month unlimited plan. I've tried it out. I like it. They use the same towers as the provider I was using before here in our part of the world, and yet so much cheaper. And they're dropping huge savings in the new year.
It looks like their unlimited plan is only $15 a month.
Can you imagine a time when you could pay $15 a month for that's what our grandparents paid for
their cell
phones? Yeah.
Well, now wait a minute. $15 a month, but does it include high-speed data? Does it include unlimited talk and text?
It's their unlimited plan, all delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can even keep your current phone and your number.
Oh, that's cool. My current phone number, says something. If you spell it out, it says something.
It's a 7-letter word.
It says something dirty.
Do you want to give us a hint?
No, not at all. So you're kind of encouraging me to ditch overpriced wireless and sign up online and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. Is that right?
Why wouldn't you want 3 months of premium wireless for just $15 a month? You can get half off an unlimited plan if you sign up before February 2nd. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month, and you'll get the plan shipped to your door for free, here's what you do. Go to mintmobile.com/omnibus.
That's mintmobile.com/omnibus. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on a first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. MLK Jr. then became the assistant pastor as he grew up, and he went to Morehouse.
He became his dad's own assistant.
He became his dad's own assistant.
That's probably not
Ebenezer.
that unusual, huh?
No, it would have been...
keeping the family.
By this point in time, Ebenezer Baptist Church was founded in 1866, and it had had all of 2 senior pastors. And MLK Jr. would have been then preaching under his father, but became, in a way you think of, and this is so often true of revolutionaries like Che and Marx even, they're not poor, right? There's something about being...
If they were poor, maybe they wouldn't have the wherewithal to become that kind of a magnetic leader, right?
That's right. You often think of them coming up, like Subcommandant Marcos is representing all these rural kind of like indigenous people, but he himself clearly, even behind his mask, smoking a pipe, speaks in the diction of Mexico City.
He's the cream of the crop, or else he wouldn't be there.
And so, but Martin Luther King Jr. really felt the calling of the social gospel and made it his life story that, he knew for, I think, most of his adult life that he was in the literal crosshairs, and in fact had a conversation with his parents not long before he was assassinated where he said, look, I may not live, and if that is my fate, then we all are constantly talking about God's will, and in my case, if I'm shot, that would be God's will. I
guess I couldn't have told you that he had that his parents had both outlived him, but in fact that was true. At his assassination, Martin Luther King Sr. was still alive.
Well, yeah, and what's interesting, another one of the kings that we don't hear about is his younger brother, Alfred Daniel, who also became a minister at Ebenezer and was also a civil rights activist who was with MLK Jr. at all of the major, at Selma, at
that's funny.
The Pettus Bridge. Like, he was there for all of the big protests, and was at the motel in Memphis in the room underneath his brother, was present when he was assassinated.
I mean, younger siblings hate to get outshone all the time, but imagine if your brother is Martin Luther King.
Well, in the family lore, he really apparently had no resentment, did not see himself as someone who lived in the spotlight, was much more of a...
He was comfortable with that?
He was comfortable being in that supporting role. But yeah, I mean, Martin Luther King Sr. not only lived to see his son win the Nobel Prize and was present at the ceremony, which is quite a leap from the humble beginnings of James Albert King.
Right.
But Martin Luther King Jr. is the grandson of A.D. Williams, right? One of the most prominent civil rights leader of his day. But unfortunately, Martin Luther King Sr. and his wife Alberta outlived MLK Jr., but also his younger brother, A.D., within less than a year of MLK's death, died under, it's a thing where, depending on where your conspiracy meter is, died under suspicious circumstances in that, everyone agreed that he had turned to drink, like his grandfather before him, but he drowned in his own swimming pool. Less than a year after Martin Luther King Jr. died. So sadly, Michael King Sr., MLK Sr., and Alberta lived to see the death of both of their sons. But then in like a final tragedy in the early 70s, because MLK Sr. remained the senior pastor at Ebenezer Church all the way through the 1970s.
I just looked this up, and now I realize, I think I remember when he passed, and it's a confusing headline.
Yeah.
For a kid to see that, wait, Martin Luther King died? No, his dad did 16 years later.
Well, yeah, he as pastor at Ebenezer into the 70s, he, in June of 1974, was giving a sermon at a different church in Atlanta, and on that day, there was a guest pastor, and Alberta was there playing the organ at Ebenezer Church, and a young black man by the name of Marcus Wayne Chanot, who was a member of the Black Hebrew Israelites.
Oh, some kind of fringe religious group?
A fringe religious group that that believed that black people were one of the tribes of Israel. And so
these guys are often downtown. You ever see these guys downtown with their booth?
Yeah. It's even now a very small fringe sect. They're not accepted by Judaism because they don't really meet any of the criteria of being a Jew. But they are opposed to Christianity, which they see as a colonizing religion. And so their practice is, like any kind of splinter group, sort of a hodgepodge. And it's maybe typically historically revisionist. But Marcus Chenot went into Ebenezer with a gun in order to kill Martin Luther King Sr. As an apostate, as a member of the
Christian establishment.
The Christian establishment. And finding him not there, he stood up in his pews and shouted that they were worshiping a false god, and shot Alberta
at the organ
and killed her.
Wow.
And so
I don't know this story. This is crazy.
Yeah, Martin Luther King Sr. then lost his wife as well. But he remained a very powerful figure in Georgia politics, so much so that when Jimmy Carter was running for president in 1976, he went and had to sort of be anointed by Martin Luther King Sr. And
which hopefully from his home state is a slam dunk.
Yeah, for sure. And and I think Martin Luther King Sr.
He's not like a secret Gerald Ford voter.
And he I think he even publicly supported Carter when Carter made some what now we would call sus remarks.
Just some gaffe about.
Yeah, just gaffe about because
something civil rights related, or
just he's also a rural Georgian, and some turn of phrase. I didn't actually figure out what it was that he said that required the intervention of Reverend King. But as you just pointed out, he did live until the 1980s, and was still. There will be people listening to this episode who are from Georgia, probably, who are extremely familiar.
Yeah, of course, he's like
whole arc
he was
of
like
his life.
One of 10 most famous people in the state.
Yeah,
for his whole life,
all the way into the 1980s. But since that time, the Ebenezer Baptist Church, a reverend by the name of Joseph Roberts followed him as what would have been then the fourth senior pastor, and he stayed in that role until 2005. So this is a church, founded immediately after the Civil War.
It's had basically 3-4 pastors?
Yeah, 4 pastors, including its founder. And the 5th pastor, who took over in 2005, is now junior senator from Georgia, Raphael Warnock.
Oh, right. Warnock was Ebenezer Baptist too.
Yeah. And Warnock remains, even as a U.S. senator, the senior pastor of Ebenezer.
I wonder what that means in practice. How often is he there of a Sunday?
Yeah, right. It does seem like he would have other work, but I think as we saw, even when Martin Luther King Sr. was pastor, he started as a junior pastor to A.D. Williams, and his son was his junior pastor. So it seems very much, and they've recently had a big building campaign. They built a huge new building. So there are within the hierarchy of the church, there are always junior pastors to cover the bases.
I mean, I'm sure publicly he describes himself as a preacher who also happens to be a U.S. senator, not a U.S. senator moonlighting as a preacher.
Right, the Jesse Jackson. And I wonder if we would tolerate preachers from other religions or other communities being sort of politically activist as we are the black churches of the South.
Well, there is this weird carve out. I don't know, like when you think about how just in the last, in our lifetimes, in maybe 20 years, religious practice has gone from this kind of insane thing where it was just assumed that everyone in America kind of had the same default religious practice, which is very weird for something as personal as faith. But we've kind of moved into something, the pendulum is swung to an equally weirder place where it's just kind of generally assumed that nobody would be religious.
Right.
And I think it would probably be eye-opening for younger people for whom religion is kind of just a shorthand for just kind of control and abuse, which is kind of the simplistic reading, I think, in a lot of modern society of what religion is, control and abuse.
Well,
to see how
the secular reading, because, of course, there are an awful lot of religious people still.
Yeah, but you know, it's like, it's now more none than other, you know, like, right? Like,
I guess it depends.
More than 50% of Americans describe themselves now as not belonging to any particular religion. And that's a number that would have been like 80-20 in our lifetimes, you know? And it's now, you know, a narrow balance, you know, it's 52-48. I am not religious. I do not have a religion. Anyway, so the pendulum is certainly swinging this other way. And I think it's probably eye-opening for these people to realize, you know, I don't know how they carve out the black church in their conception of this, but like how fundamental religious faith and like weirdly Christianity in particular was to the great social movement of the 20th century. You know, it just could not have happened without the black church.
You know, I have different statistics about the religiosity of the United States. In my sense of it, almost 70% of Americans, and that's Americans, not Southern Americans, still identify as Christians. They don't maybe go to church, but they still do say, when the chips are down, that not only are they religious, but they're Christian religious. And less than 10% of Americans identify themselves as part of a non-Christian religion.
Yeah, you're right. It's not half, but it's about 30% now. And I wonder what the question is that gets you above 50, because there are questions about practice that'll now get you.
I bet it's if you go to church, because there are an awful lot of churches in my neighborhood that have 4 cars in the parking lot. Of course, the evangelical churches that have rock bands, those parking lots are overflowing.
Do you think that's what's slowing down the rise of secularism? Christian rock?
I do feel like
we finally found something that everyone loves.
Because, you know, the mid-century, or the 50s and early 60s was like peak church going. And so any mid-century neighborhood has a church on every block like mine does. And they're all the coolest buildings, but nobody's in them. And I keep thinking, well, how long before I can live in one?
That's what Scarecrow Video is actually thinking, you know, like... Yeah. Like we think the store will survive. We don't think it's going to stay in the university district forever because that's a very changing neighborhood. What's the church that's going to go under at the exact right time
that we can move
for us to take over? You and Scarecrow Video will one day be fighting over.
Oh, I can only hope. If you think about the objection to John F. Kennedy was not that he was a Catholic priest, but that he practiced Catholicism in any way.
A Catholic parishioner.
Can you imagine if he had been, or if Mitt Romney had been not just an elder, but had been what is the term in Mormonism for a priest?
He could have been he could have been some church-wide authority. Yeah. You know, up to and including an apostle.
Right.
But he wasn't.
He wasn't. But if he had been,
he was some regional.
Could he have been a Republican candidate for president if he had actually been like an apostle? I don't know.
I mean, I think there were objections to, I mean, there have been objections to that in the past when Mormon apostles have been, elected to the Senate or appointed to the Senate. Yeah. For example, those polygamy era. No, like
the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I think Reed Smoot was not. There were hearings to determine whether or not he could be a senator when the Utah legislature elected him because of his
Smoot,
several wives.
He belongs up there with Henry Fosdick and Walter Rauschenbusch.
Yeah, I mean, but he did give his name to the Smoot-Hawley tariff, so you have pleasantly old-timey nomenclature helping out in AP U.S. history.
And you know, the Smoot-Hawley tariff and the Kansas-Nebraska Act are both things that I keep wanting to enter into the omnibus. And we've talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Well, tariffs are going to be newly current.
Yeah, let's do Smoot-Hawley soon.
Well, you know, every time we mention an upcoming show, we alter this game that people play on the Discord where they try to guess the topic of each upcoming show?
Completely without any...
Right. And one winner is always named just based on vibes.
Yeah.
Like, well, it was kind of medieval, or, well, yeah, you said something Asian.
Right.
But anytime you and I say something that might be coming up, somebody will just camp on that forever.
They'll just say it. Smoot Holly, Smoot Holly.
It'll be Smoot Holly this week. Smoot Holly. Who will be first to say Smoot Holly? So maybe we should make them wait a few years.
But here's the other thing. Every time we say that, we almost never do that episode.
Because we never remember.
Yeah, right.
Like in 10 minutes, I'm going to be like,
what were you talking about? What was that episode on?
What, Holly?
But anyway, I mean, Martin Luther King Sr.'s life marked by tragedy toward the end, but he really, it turns out he was a pivotal figure, and his father-in-law was a pivotal figure. Martin Luther King Jr. was an inheritor, and obviously, a great American and someone who took that theology to its, sort of activist apogee.
As a parent, would you be proud of a child with your name who outshone you, or would you be like, hey, that was my name?
I have to imagine that every parent whose child outshines them must be proud.
That would be my dream.
Right? Can't you? I mean, the last thing you want is to be a Tom Hanks who has a Chet Hanks, and you have to every day be like, well.
At least he's not Tom Hanks Jr., right? Maybe he was.
Chet Hanks?
Yeah, we're going to change it to Chet. You get rid of those dreads, Tom Jr., or you are changing your name to Chet. And that concludes Martin Luther King Sr., entry 688.PR1301, certificate number 45274, in the omnibus. Is social media on the mend? Will Blue Sky save us? I don't know. I'm sure you can find at Ken Jennings or at John Roderick someplace in the microblogosphere. You could also email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com or send physical items to P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington 98155. I got a couple. Let's see, what do I have here? It looks like Chris sent us, I hope with explanation. Oh, here we go. There's a letter, a cover letter. Chris from Bakersfield has sent us things in the past before, including an RC Cola can.
In the past before?
Yes.
What is the past before?
Not just the past is before now.
No, but I mean, the past before is before the past.
Yes, it's both the past and before.
Okay.
It has to be both.
He sent us in the past before a gift.
I can't remember.
Gifts.
It says a Borax coffee mug, Universal Studios hat pin, and an RC Cola can.
Yeah, I have that prominently displayed.
He has a friend who started a podcast of his own called Notorious Bakersfield, about, I guess...
Bakersfield's a rough town.
Some of the darker sides of Bakersfield history, and now has turned some of those entries into a book. And the author signed it to us. So now we have a copy to Ken and John of, I guess it's from both. Oh, it's from, there we go. Both co-authors have signed it. There we go.
I have a friend who grew up as a chola in a norteño gang in Bakersfield who has a very different hot take on, I'm always like, oh yeah, Bakersfield, like,
Buck Owens.
And she's like, no, that wasn't my Bakersfield.
Not really all Buck Owens to me. Thank you so much, Chris, and to the authors of Notorious Bakersfield. Check out that podcast. Why not?
Why not?
This, we got a copy from Colin with perhaps no explanatory note, but you can see why. He sent us a booklet called The Great Floods of Pennsylvania, a 2-Century History.
We have we've covered at least one,
Yes.
but this most recent set of Appalachian floods has really ramped it up.
There is a note. Yes, Colin sent us an Olympia Brewing Company postcard.
Is that from before the Olympia Brewing Company closed down in Olympia?
I don't see any artisans here at all.
Oh, that's too bad.
It must be from back in the day, yeah. And he wants us to do a show on beer mascots, perhaps like, I don't know the name of the Olympia bear, but Olympia used to have a bear.
I think Olympia bear. He kind of looks like the Hams.
He does look like the Hams bear. Did they just rip off a better-known beer bear?
I wonder if the Hams company bought Olympia beer.
Oh, is that why? Is this the same bear? He recommends this book and would like to see more Philadelphia flood content, I guess. Besides his beer mascot show.
So it was purchased by the Heilmann Brew Company. Oh, but now Pabst owns it. And Pabst...
But it was never Hams, or it was?
Well, the thing is, I bet you Pabst
Also owns the bear.
owns Hams. Or maybe it was Heilmann that owned Hams. All these wonderful things that, I'm just... So Heilmann owns Stroh's. Does Stroh's own Hams? You've never had a beer, so you don't know what I'm talking about.
I don't even know if having a beer would help me know if Stroh's owns Hams. It's possible it would kill enough brain cells that I'd be less likely to know whether or not Stroh's owns Hams.
They own both Olympia and Rainier Beer, classic competitors in Washington State.
There should be monopoly protection to break down a Rainier Olympia alliance. And our friend David Chelsea from Portland, who always sends us the most beautiful items.
His art is truly...
Yeah, we have another beautiful, another beautifully watercolored envelope here commemorating Kirk Douglas's Spartacus.
Look at that.
It's just amazing.
So great.
And he thought of, I guess, maybe on a plane. It's not a barf bag anymore, but at some point he doodled us a bunch of omnibus tartans in various, various portions of the omnibus brand, including... It must have just been things we were talking about in the show, because suddenly here's Lily Sobieski with no tartan material at all.
He's probably
listening to the Tartan Show and just doodling whatever came out in comic form, and it's beautiful work. Yeah, here's Train Spotting, here's Midges, here's Aberdeen. Yeah, this is all just this is a comic adaptation of the Tartan Show. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, David. He also sent us the Tartans page from a 1960s era World Book Encyclopedia.
Oh, look at that.
Or color photocopy of same. It does not say anything about how the tartans are fairly recent inventions. According to World Book, it's all ancient Gaelic lore. Thank you so much, David. That's fantastic. The best way to contribute to Omnibus, if you're not going to watercolor us a Spartacus postcard, which maybe everyone should.
Yeah.
We expect that.
Do your best.
And many of you have fallen short. And in that case, there's nothing to do but either to get out your watercolors right now or to make up for your lapse by going to patreon.com/omnibus project and seeing if there's other non-watercolor ways, non-aquatint ways to support the show. The smallest of monthly contributions, a $5 level, will give you access to just an amazing panoply of privileges and prizes. So you'll want to check that out at patreon.com/omnibus project.
I feel like, once I started saying many goods and cheese, there are an awful lot of people now that wish me many goods and cheese just in passing as I walk down the street.
Supermarket.
And I feel like if we just made it a requirement that you...
Sent us cheese?
No, that you watercolor Kirk Douglas and Spartacus. Most people won't, but a few will. I mean,
I like that they're all going to be worse than David's art, and I want to display the terrible attempts next to his beautiful envelopes.
Yeah. Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus. And we wish you many good